All right, let's talk about Cuba. When you think of this island, what comes to mind? Maybe it's cigars, old cars, revolution? Well, the real story is so much deeper. It's this incredible, centuries-long fight for the right to just be itself. That's what we're digging into today. Cuba's unfinished quest for independence.
So where does the story even start? You have to go all the way back to 1492. Christopher Columbus shows up and he is just blown away. He calls it the most beautiful land human eyes have ever seen. But that moment of awe, it was really the beginning of a tragic transformation, one that would change Cuba forever.
You see, before Columbus, Cuba was home to the Taino and Siboney peoples. Their life was, pretty harmonious. They were farmers and fishers, they had their communities. Then, everything changed. The arrival of the Europeans was an absolute catastrophe. Disease, forced labor, we're talking about a 90% population collapse in less than a century. An entire world was almost completely wiped out. It's just staggering. Okay, so with the indigenous population pretty much gone, Spain tightens its grip. And this kicks off a colonial era that's going to last for nearly 400 years. 4 centuries that would literally forge the soul of the island. So what was Spanish Cuba all about? Well, in a word, money. It was a total economic powerhouse, but it was built on a brutal foundation. You had a booming sugar and tobacco economy, and to make that run, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought over. Havana, it became the absolute jewel of the Spanish Empire, this bustling hub for trade. Of course, all that wealth made it a huge target for pirates too. But through all of this, that dream of freedom just refused to die. And what's really incredible is the sheer persistence of the Cuban people. Look at this timeline. We're talking 3 major wars for independence against Spain in the span of just 30 years. The final push was led by this guy, José Martí. He's a national hero. And even though he died early in the fighting, his sacrifice became the spark that ignited the whole nation. So it looks like they're finally going to do it. Independence is right there, within reach. Spain is on the ropes. But then, the story takes a massive turn. A new power, a very powerful one, steps onto the stage and is about to change everything. And this really sets up the key question for this whole era, right? Cuba gets its independence from Spain, but is it actually free? That question is going to define the next 100 years of its history. So here's what happens. It's 1898, and the American battleship, the USS Maine, blows up in Havana Harbor. The U.S. points the finger at Spain, war is declared, and it's over pretty quick. The U.S. wins. Cuba is officially declared independent, but, and this is a huge but, it came with some serious strings attached. The U.S. gave itself the right to intervene whenever it wanted, it took control of Guantanamo Bay, and it basically dominated Cuba's economy and politics. So, in reality, Cuba just traded one colonial master for another. And this whole period of American influence really comes to a head under the dictator Fulgencio Batista. His Cuba was a place of 2 completely different worlds. On one hand, for the American mob, for rich investors, it was a paradise. You had casinos, hotels, all this glamour. But on the other hand, for most Cubans, especially out in the countryside, it was a total nightmare of corruption, poverty, and brutal inequality. And it's that feeling, that sense that your country has become a playground for foreigners while you suffer, well, that's the perfect recipe for a revolution. And that revolution, it was a storm that was about to hit. This next chapter isn't just about Cuba anymore. It's about a small island that suddenly finds itself at the dead center of the Cold War, with the fate of the entire world hanging in the balance. No exaggeration. So how did a small group of rebels actually pull this off? You can really break it down into 4 steps. It all kicks off in 1953 with a failed attack led by young Fidel Castro. It failed, but it sent a message. Then in '56, Castro and a small band of rebels, including a guy you might have heard of, Che Guevara, come back to Cuba on a tiny yacht. From there, they wage a guerrilla war from the mountains. They start small, but support just grows and grows. And then, New Year's Day, 1959, Batista gets on a plane and flees the country. Just like that, the revolution had won. And the new revolutionary government did not waste any time. Castro's team moved incredibly fast. They nationalized all the foreign-owned industries, a lot of them American, and they started redistributing land. Now you gotta understand, these weren't just simple policy changes. This was a direct shot at decades of American control. It was a decisive break, and it pushed Cuba straight into an alliance with the Soviet Union. And that new alliance with the Soviets, well, it would lead to what is, without a doubt, the single most dangerous moment in human history,
Seriously, a moment when the entire world stood on the brink, when the Cold War almost went from cold to nuclear hot. Right there, 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Just 13 days. For 13 days in October of 1962, the entire planet held its breath, literally staring down the barrel of nuclear war.
So what happened? The Soviets had secretly put nuclear missiles in Cuba, missiles that could hit almost any city in the US in minutes. What followed was this incredibly tense standoff. But a deal was struck at the very last second. The Soviets agreed they'd pull the missiles out. In return, the US promised, publicly, that they would never invade Cuba. The world took a massive step back from the edge, but one thing was crystal clear. Cuba was now a permanent fixture at the heart of the Cold War.
So, the Cold War eventually ends. But for Cuba, that brings a whole new, terrifying challenge. What do you do when your superpower patron, the country your entire economy depends on, just vanishes?
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba's lifeline was cut. Just gone, overnight. The country fell into what they called the special period, and it was brutal. We're talking extreme economic hardship, massive shortages of fuel, food rationing, everything. It was a genuine test of whether the country itself could even survive.
Moving into our own century, things have started to shift, even if it's been slow. Fidel's brother, Raul Castro, took over and started allowing some small private businesses. Then, of course, you had that historic moment in 2015 when diplomatic ties with the U.S. were restored and tourism just exploded. But it's not a simple happily ever after. The big challenges like the U.S. embargo and all the internal economic problems, they're still very much there.
So that's where we are today. Cuba is still at this incredible crossroads. You look back at the last 500 years, and it's been one long fight for its own identity. First against Spain, then the US, then navigating the Cold War, and now it's caught between its revolutionary ideals and the massive pressure to change and reform. The quest for what it means to be truly independent isn't over. So the big question remains, what does the next chapter for Cuba even look like?